In the autumn of 1374, an atmosphere of undisguised threat thickened over the steppes of the Deshti Kipchak. The landscape was painted in grim, bloody tones, and the sharp temperature swings, from daytime warmth to nightly cold, only intensified the general tension. Experienced warriors, their faces like tanned leather, gazed anxiously at the heavens, sensing that something terrible was coming. This dull premonition of disaster was confirmed by numerous specific signs. The higher powers, it seemed, had abandoned the ulus of Yochi. People believed that the celestial patron Tengri had turned his back on them, as comets with fiery tails appeared ever more frequently in the sky, and livestock bore deformed offspring. Even wild animals, sensing trouble, were leaving their lairs. The universe itself seemed to foretell the Horde's imminent demise, and these signs were but a reflection of a deep political crisis. The once invincible Golden Horde, whose influence stretched from the lands of Egypt to the borders of China, was in its death throes. This period of internal decay, which had already lasted for 15 years, entered the Russian chronicles as the Great Troubles. The source of the chaos was the assassination of Khan Berdebek, the last direct male-line descendant of Batu. With the end of the legitimate dynasty, the great power plunged into a maelstrom of chaos. After the death of the legitimate heir, a merciless struggle for power erupted in the Horde. Khans on the throne of Sarai changed with kaleidoscopic speed. More than 24 were replaced in a decade. Influential emirs and hastily convened kurultais elevated new rulers to the throne, whose power might last for months, weeks, or even a single day. Each of them, striving to hold the throne, gave away lands and riches, ultimately destroying the centralized government. The state had effectively fractured into several warring parts. In the Volga region, where the capitals of Sarai and New Sarai were located, there was incessant bloodshed, and the families of overthrown rulers retreated to their nomadic camps to gather strength for revenge. Meanwhile, in the western part, from the Don to the Crimea, the powerful Temnik Mamai had seized real power. Not being a Genghisid, he had no right to the title of Khan and ruled through puppet Khans from the house of Batu. The descendants of Orda Egen, who ruled the eastern part of the empire known as the Kok Orda, or Blue Horde, looked with contempt upon the chaos that had engulfed the western lands beyond the Yike River. The great trade routes, once a source of the Golden Horde's fabled wealth, had fallen into complete ruin. With the collapse of central authority, the empire's economic power dried up, as its commercial arteries were left completely defenseless. Lawlessness reigned everywhere. Merchant caravans became easy prey for any band of robbers. Russian river pirates, the Ushkwiniks, plundered the Horde's cities on the Volga with impunity, even attacking the capital, New Sarai. Tribute from the Russian lands, if it arrived at all, was irregular and ended up in Mamai's treasury, never reaching the center. The Horde was rapidly losing control over its territories and tributaries. In this world of total betrayal, where loyalty was considered foolishness and the right to rule was granted only by a sharp blade, the young Muscovite prince Dmitry Ivanovich began to act in his own interests. He was cunning, ambitious, and watched the agony of his powerful neighbor closely, increasingly ignoring its commands. The decline of the Horde was creating the conditions for the birth of a completely new era. In the shadow of these great and terrible events, in the east of the disintegrating empire, a young man from the line of Genghis Khan was growing up. His name was Tokhtamysh, and he was just one of dozens of such noble but destitute claimants to the throne. Without an army, money, or influential allies, his only assets were pride, high birth, and immense ambition. But he did not yet know what a great and tragic destiny awaited him. He was the one destined to become the last great Khan of the Golden Horde. First, with incredible force, he would reassemble the crumbling empire, reviving its former glory from the days of Janibek's reign. Then, blinded by his own pride, he would challenge the most fearsome conqueror of that era, which would lead his people to a catastrophe from which they would never recover. His biography is a requiem for an entire empire. The fate of Tokhtamysh is an epic drama of a dizzying rise and a devastating fall, a story of friendship that turned into a mortal enmity. His reign became the last bright fire that illuminated the fading nomadic empire before it plunged into darkness. And this journey begins in Samarkand, at the foot of the throne of the great Tamerlane, for fate often humiliates a man before raising him to the summit. For the young Tokhtamysh, this humiliation was especially bitter. In the era of the Great Troubles, high birth gave Tokhtamysh no advantages. On the contrary, his status as a descendant of Genghis Khan turned him into a living target, as the steppe was filled with other jochids ready to destroy any rival on the path to power. In this turbulent time, nobility was tantamount to a death sentence, and he belonged to a very influential branch of the ruling clan. Tokhtamysh was a descendant of Timur, the 13th son of Jochi, the eldest son of Genghis Khan. His father, Tuikhoja Oglan, was the ruler of Mangishlak and a representative of one of the most noble lines in the Blue Horde. Such an origin made his family an extremely dangerous competitor for anyone who aspired to supreme power, and it was this nobility that became the cause of the fatal conflict with the ruler of the Blue Horde, Urus Khan. The ruler of the Blue Horde, Urus Khan, was an extraordinary individual. A descendant of Jochi from another branch, he was distinguished by his cruelty, imperiousness, and enormous ambitions. He had managed to establish order with an iron fist in his part of the crumbling empire. This strong and dangerous leader dreamed of uniting the entire Golden Horde under his rule and tolerated no competitors in his path. Striving for sole power over the entire horde, Urus Khan systematically eliminated any potential rivals. Tuikhoja, Tokhtamysh's father, with his noble birth and independent behavior, was a serious obstacle for him. He likely refused to support Urus Khan's campaign to the west, to Sarai, and conflict between them became inevitable. Urus Khan resolved this problem radically. In 1376, by order of Urus Khan, Tuikhoja was executed. In an instant, Tokhtamysh became the son of an enemy of the people, stripped of his status, wealth, and future. His own life was under mortal threat, and the only way out for him was immediate flight. Tokhtamysh was forced to flee for his life, but where could a disgraced prince run from the endless steppe? For a disgraced Genghisid, there was only one path to salvation: south, across the Sir-Daria River, into the lands of Transoxiana. It was there that the star of a new, formidable conqueror was rising. His name was Timur, but he went down in history under the nickname Tamerlane, which meant Timur the Lame. Fate was leading Tokhtamysh straight into the hands of the most dangerous man of that era, and to understand the events that followed, one must understand who this man was. The fates of Tokhtamysh and Timur became so tightly intertwined that the story of one is unthinkable without understanding the personality of the other. They were like two sides of the same coin, and their paths were tied in a knot that only death could sever. Their stories are inseparable, but the main difference between Timur and Tokhtamysh lay in his origin. Unlike Tokhtamysh, Timur was not a Genghisid. He came from the Turkified Mongol tribe of Barlas, and according to the laws of the Yasa, had no right to the title of Khan. He bore the title of Emir his entire life, ruling through figurehead Khans, He more than compensated for his lack of noble blood with military genius, unsurpassed cunning, and extreme cruelty. His real power was immeasurably greater than his formal title. The physical injuries he received in his youth did not break Timur's will. A limp in his right leg and a damaged right hand only hardened his character. By the time Tokhtamysh appeared in his domains, he had already crushed all rivals in internecine strife and become the sole master of Transoxiana. He was a ruthless and battle-hardened ruler, and his capital, Samarkand, was rapidly becoming the center of the world. Timur was a highly contradictory figure. On one hand, a merciless destroyer who built pyramids from severed heads. On the other, a fine connoisseur of art and a zealous patron of Islam. He brought the best craftsmen and untold riches to his capital, Samarkand, striving to make it the most magnificent city in the world. His personality combined the traits of a savage barbarian and a refined aesthete. It was to this center of power and danger that Tokhtamysh arrived in the autumn of 1376. In the autumn of 1376, a ragged and exhausted fugitive, with only a handful of loyal nukers behind him, appeared before the Iron Lam. Timur's court in Samarkand was a magnet for adventurers and exiles from all over Asia. The contrast between the young, dispossessed prince and the powerful, celebrated ruler was immense. He found himself in the throne room, surrounded by formidable, battle-hardened commanders. The meeting took place in the Koksarai Palace in Samarkand. The walls of the hall were adorned with frescoes depicting the emir's victories, and his loyal commanders stood by the throne. Timur himself, a man with pale skin and a reddish beard, did not have a remarkable appearance, but his dull eyes, according to his contemporaries, possessed a gaze that pierced the very soul and inspired a chilling fear. Timur's appearance was deceptive. His inner strength was colossal. In this oppressive atmosphere, Tokhtamysh told his story. He did not beg for mercy or ask for alms. Appealing to his legitimate lineage and the injustice committed by Genghis Khan, he demanded justice and help in restoring his rights. He carried himself with dignity, and Timur, being a master of political intrigue, immediately saw his advantage in this. An experienced politician, Timur instantly recognized the ragged prince as a priceless asset. The Golden Horde, his powerful northern neighbor, had always been both a threat and a coveted prize for him. He well remembered how the Khans of the Horde had interfered in the affairs of Transoxiana in the past. Timur thought strategically, not emotionally. A strong and united horde, under the rule of the ambitious Genghis Khan, represented a mortal danger to Timur. A horde torn by civil strife, in which he could secretly direct events, was far more advantageous. Tokhtamysh, as a legitimate Genghisid, was the ideal candidate for the role of a puppet, through whom he could replace a strong enemy on his northern flank with a dependent ally. Timur made his decision. He did not just offer the fugitive hospitality, but gave him a royal reception, publicly calling Tokhtamysh his son. He granted him the border cities of Otrar and Sauron and supplied him with money, weapons, and troops for a campaign into the Deshti Kipchak. It was a generous investment in his own political project, but for Tokhtamysh, it seemed like an incredible gift of fate. For the young exile, this was a unique chance, granted by the heavens themselves. He was dazzled and delighted by the emir's generosity, and at that moment, he probably felt a sincere devotion to him. He did not yet understand the true motives of his patron, and did not see that the favor of rulers always comes at a price, and that Timur had already begun to entangle his fate with threads of steel. The grace of the great is never selfless. Tokhtamysh did not notice that he had become merely a blade that Timur was preparing to strike Genghis Khan with. No one in Samarkand that day could have imagined that this obedient weapon would one day turn against its creator. A weapon can be double-edged. Thus began the first act of the drama, in which Tokhtamysh prepared to carve his way to the throne. Having received an army and resources from Timur, Tokhtamysh transformed from a powerless fugitive into a formidable contender for the throne of the Blue Horde. His main goal was the throne occupied by his blood enemy, Genghis Khan. He began his long and bloody path to power, which consisted of several desperate and risky attempts. The path to the throne required incredible perseverance and a readiness to shed blood. This was not one swift and victorious campaign, but a series of desperate lunges, each of which was mortally dangerous for Tokhtamysh. It was in this cruel struggle that his unbending character was forged. In the winter of 1376-1377, he began his first invasion. In the winter of 1376-1377, Tokhtamysh invaded the domains of Genghis Khan, who at that moment was distracted by a war on his western borders. At first, he was successful. He won several local victories, and discontented clans began to switch to his side. However, as soon as Genghis Khan moved his main army against him, luck turned away from the young contender. His forces were clearly insufficient for an open confrontation. In the first major battle, Tokhtamysh's army was utterly defeated by the battle-hardened troops of Genghis Khan. Suffering a crushing defeat and losing almost all his warriors, he was forced to flee again, saving his life. With shame, not victory, he returned to Samarkand to his patron. Anyone else in Timur's place would have denied him further support. But the Iron Lame did not abandon his plan. He understood that Tokhtamysh was a long-term investment and was not going to back down after the first failure. He once again welcomed the fugitive, scolded him for his carelessness, but provided him with a new army, even larger and better equipped. Given a second chance, Tokhtamysh invaded the steppe again. This time, Tokhtamysh acted much more cautiously, avoiding major battles and waging a guerrilla war. The heir of Genghis Khan, the young but already famous warrior Kutluk Buga, was sent against him. Fate brought them together in a fierce skirmish, in which the heir to the throne was accidentally killed by a stray arrow. This death had dual consequences. On one hand, one of Tokhtamysh's main enemies was eliminated. On the other, it provoked the unbridled wrath of Genghis Khan, who now craved not just victory, but personal revenge for the death of his son. The situation escalated to the extreme, and the old Khan personally led a campaign against his heir's killer. Genghis Khan besieged Tokhtamysh in the city of Sauron, and his position became critical. Timur, realizing he could not allow his protege to be destroyed, intervened in the conflict again. The Iron Lame personally marched with a huge army to meet Genghis Khan to save his client. The two great armies met on the banks of the Sir Daria. The opponents stood facing each other for several days, hesitating to start a general battle. In the end, nature itself intervened. An abnormally severe and snowy winter began, making the continuation of hostilities impossible. The armies dispersed without ever engaging in battle. The weather saved Tokhtamysh, and soon fate gave him another gift. In 1377, the powerful Genghis Khan died. Immediately after his death, a fierce struggle for power began among his heirs in the Blue Horde. The death of his main enemy opened a new window of opportunity for Tokhtamysh. First, the second son of Genghis Khan ascended the throne, but his reign was short-lived. The second son of Genghis Khan, Tokhtamysh, ruled for only a few months before dying. The throne was taken by the third heir, Timur Malik, who was the complete opposite of his father and brothers. Prone to drunkenness and debauchery, he had neither talent nor authority, and quickly lost the support of the nobility. His rule caused mass discontent, which Tokhtamysh immediately exploited. Realizing that his moment had come, Tokhtamysh invaded the Blue Horde for the third time. Emirs, disillusioned with Timur Malik's rule, defected to his side in droves. In the decisive battle, the unworthy heir's army was completely routed, and he himself was killed. Tokhtamysh had finally achieved his goal. In the spring of 1378, he was proclaimed Khan of the Blue Horde. In the spring of 1378, after 2 years of exile and defeats, Tokhtamysh ascended the throne of the Blue Horde. His triumph was complete, but he had no intention of stopping there. The eastern part of the empire was just a stepping stone for him on the path to the main throne of the entire Golden Horde, which was located in Sarai. Meanwhile, events in the west were unfolding in his favor. In that same year, 1378, Mamai's protege, Khan Arab Shah, suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Muscovite prince Dmitry in the Battle of the Volga River. This was the first time the Horde's forces had been defeated by the Russians in an open field battle, and Mamai's authority, already shaky, was severely undermined. 2 years later, an even more devastating blow followed, the Battle of Kulikovo Field. In 1380, Mamai, having gathered all his forces and made an alliance with the Lithuanian prince Jogaila, marched on Moscow to punish his defiant vassal. However, on Kulikovo Field, at the confluence of the Don and Nepriadva rivers, his army was completely routed by the united Russian regiments. For Mamai, this was not just a military disaster, but a catastrophe for his image. In the eyes of the steppe nomads, he ceased to be a successful leader and completely lost his legitimacy. Mamai's defeat was the signal for Tokhtamysh to act immediately. He realized he needed to strike while his main rival was weak and demoralized. Gathering all the forces of the Blue Horde, he moved his troops west to the Volga region to seize power in Sarai and finish off his competitor for good. Mamai frantically tried to assemble a new army, but the emirs and common warriors were already looking to the east, from where a new power was coming, the legitimate Khan, Tokhtamysh. The decisive meeting of the two armies took place in the autumn of 1380 on the Kalka River. There was no real battle. Mamai's warriors defected en masse to the side of the Genghisid, unwilling to fight for an illegitimate ruler. Tokhtamysh's legitimacy proved to be the deciding factor. Abandoned by all, Mamai fled with a handful of loyal nukers to the Crimea, to the Genoese colony of Kaffa, where he had long-standing business ties. However, the Genoese, always sensing which way the wind was blowing, decided not to quarrel with the new powerful ruler of the Horde. According to one version, they simply did not let him into the city. According to another, they let him in and treacherously killed him on the orders of Tokhtamysh's emissaries. Thus ended the story of the usurper. In early 1381, Tokhtamysh triumphantly entered Sarai. The 20-year Great Troubles that had tormented the Horde came to an end. On the throne was a young, energetic, and most importantly, legitimate Khan, who had managed to unite what seemed impossible, both wings of the Ulus of Jochi. Having united a vast empire from the Irtysh to the Dniester under his rule, Tokhtamysh immediately turned his gaze to his Russian vassals. During the years of turmoil, they had forgotten their subordinate position, and the new Khan's first target was the victor over his predecessor at Kulikovo Field. Restoring full control over Uluses became his main priority. Within the Horde itself, ravaged by 2 decades of bloody civil war, Tokhtamysh's accession was met with enormous relief. The people craved order, stability, and a strong government. The young and successful Khan seemed to be precisely the ruler who could restore the state to its former greatness. Great hopes were placed upon him. Tokhtamysh seemed like the ideal ruler. He was young, energetic, successful in battle, and most importantly, his descent from Genghis Khan gave him undeniable legitimacy in the eyes of the people. His ascension to the throne was perceived as the end of the curse of the Great Troubles and the beginning of a new, glorious era. His first steps on the throne fully justified these expectations. Tokhtamysh's first actions were swift, harsh, and decisive. He eliminated the remnants of Mamai's supporters and other separatists. A wave of executions swept through the steppe. He either destroyed all the emirs who posed the slightest threat to his power, or forced them to swear allegiance, brutally consolidating power in his hands. He completely restored the chain of command that had been destroyed during the years of turmoil. He appointed his loyal men, mostly emirs, who had come with him from the east, from the Blue Horde, as governors in all key uluses. In this way, he created a new, absolutely loyal administration, and simultaneously began to restore the economy. In the economic sphere, he focused on reviving the caravan routes. He sent out detachments to ruthlessly combat robbers, confirmed the old trade privileges for Genoese and Venetian merchants, and to stabilize the financial system, he began minting a new, full-weight coin with his name. He pursued a rational and balanced economic policy. Tokhtamysh was a restorer, not a reformer. His main goal was to re-establish the good old order of the times of the powerful Khans, Uzbek and Janibek. This order implied the unconditional submission of all vassals, and this primarily concerned the Russian princes. He sought to bring back past greatness, not to build something new. Dmitry of Moscow's victory at Kulikovo Field had immense psychological significance for Rus. However, from Tokhtamysh's perspective, it was an act of blatant insubordination by a vassal to his suzerain. It did not matter that Dmitry had defeated his personal enemy, Mamai. Any armed resistance to the authority of Sarai was regarded as rebellion. By rising against Mamai, Dmitry had, in effect, risen against the authority of the Khan as such. Tokhtamysh could not let this act of defiance go unpunished, otherwise it would be seen as a sign of weakness. Therefore, punishing Moscow was not a matter of personal revenge for him, but an act of political necessity to assert his status as an all-powerful ruler. Immediately after his enthronement in the autumn of 1380, Tokhtamysh sent envoys to all the Russian princes. The messages contained a demand to appear immediately in the horde, with tribute and obeisance. The envoys explained that the new Khan had defeated their common enemy Mamai, and that peace should now reign in Rus under his firm hand. He demanded the immediate restoration of vassalage. Most of the Russian princes, including Moscow's rivals, understood perfectly well the difference between the usurper Mamai and the legitimate Genghisid Tokhtamysh, and immediately sent envoys to the horde with declarations of submission. However, Dmitry of Moscow, still euphoric after the Kulikovo victory, hesitated. He received the envoys with honor, but he did not go to the horde himself and was in no hurry to pay the tribute. The entire year of 1381 passed in a state of uncertainty. Dmitry made a fatal miscalculation. He hoped that Tokhtamysh would have enough internal problems and would not have time for Moscow. He fatally underestimated the determination, strength, and ambition of the new ruler of the steppe. Tokhtamysh regarded this silence as a direct insult. After spending a year consolidating his power within the horde, in the summer of 1382, Tokhtamysh gathered a huge army for a punitive campaign. His goal was not just to collect tribute, but to deliver a demonstrative humiliation to Moscow. He wanted to show all his vassals that any attempt to challenge his authority would be drowned in blood. The campaign was a demonstration of absolute power. To ensure maximum surprise for the invasion, Tokhtamysh resorted to a ruse. He ordered the arrest and robbery of all Russian merchants in the horde cities and confiscated their ships. This was done so that no one could warn Moscow of the impending attack. After that, the call to gather an army was sounded across the steppe. The united horde, eager for rich booty, readily answered its Khan's call. A huge army moved north to avenge the humiliation inflicted upon Mamai. Moscow did not yet know what a terrible storm was gathering over its walls. The summer of 1382 in Rus was deceptively calm and serene. The summer of 1382 in Rus was hot and peaceful. 2 years had passed since the victory at Kulikovo Field, and it seemed to many that the threat of the yoke had passed forever. This atmosphere of self-confidence and euphoria played a cruel joke on Moscow, as the city found itself completely unprepared for a sudden attack. Tokhtamysh, however, was preparing his strike in deep secrecy. To remain unnoticed and catch the Russian outposts by surprise, Tokhtamysh led his army around the traditional southern routes. His army moved along the right bank of the Volga, concealing its advance. His strategy was based entirely on surprise. The first to learn of the approach of the innumerable enemy host was the Prince of Nizhny Novgorod. The Prince of Nizhny Novgorod Suzdal, Dmitry Konstantinovich, the father-in-law of Dmitry Donskoy, was the first to learn of the horde's approach. Faced with the choice of fighting or submitting, he chose to save his lands. Not only did he fail to warn his son-in-law of the danger, but he committed an act of direct betrayal, sending his 2 sons, Vasily and Semyon, as guides for the horde's army. Prince Oleg of Ryazan, whose lands lay directly in the path of the horde, also chose not to resist. He well remembered how Mamai had ravaged his principality on the way to Kulikovo Field and didn't want a repeat. He showed Tokhtamysh the fords on the Oka River, ensuring his army an unimpeded invasion into the very heart of the Moscow Principality. The betrayal of his neighbors and the surprise of the attack deprived Dmitry Donskoy of the time to gather his forces. Caught off guard, he took a highly controversial step. He left Moscow and went north to Kostroma, as the chronicle says, to gather an army. In fact, the Grand Prince left his capital defenseless in the face of a mortal enemy. Along with Dmitry, his cousin, Vladimir of Serpukhov, also left the city. Only the Grand Princess Eudoxia and Metropolitan Cyprian remained in the capital. The departure of the rulers and military leaders immediately caused panic and chaos in the city. The boyars rushed to flee, but the common people decided they would defend themselves to the end. The common Muscovites, the black people, feeling betrayed, rose in rebellion. They convened a vesh, sealed the city gates, and decided to defend themselves on their own. Those boyars who had not managed to escape were either killed by the rebels or forced to lead the defense. The people took the city's protection into their own hands. On August 23, 1382, Tokhtamysh's advanced detachments approached Moscow. The defense of the city was led by a young Lithuanian prince, Ostej, a grandson of Algirdas, who happened to be there. Thanks to the new white stone Kremlin built in 1367, the city was well fortified and prepared for a long siege. The Muscovites were full of determination to defend themselves. Despite the absence of the prince and experienced commanders, the Muscovites put up fierce resistance. They showered the besiegers with taunts and curses from the walls. The chronicle even preserves the name of a cloth merchant, Adam, who stood on the Frolovsky gates and loudly reviled the Khan himself. For the first time in history, Moscow offered armed resistance to the horde. The defenders not only successfully repelled attacks, but also made daring sorties themselves. They even had firearms at their disposal, tyofiaks, and primitive cannons. For 3 days, the horde's forces, lacking siege equipment, suffered huge losses in unsuccessful assaults. A direct storm of the city had completely failed. Realizing that the city could not be taken by force, Tokhtamysh resorted to a proven trick. On the fourth day of the siege, August 26th, noble horde Murzas, accompanied by the two Russian princes, Vasily and Semyon, sons of the Nizhny Novgorod ruler, rode up to the walls. They addressed the city's defenders with a proposal of peace. They swore that Tokhtamysh was only at war with Prince Dmitry, not with the city. The Khan, they said, only wanted to look upon his patrimony, Moscow. They promised a full pardon and peace if the residents voluntarily opened the gates and came out with gifts. They guaranteed that not a hair on their heads would be harmed. These were false guarantees. Exhausted by the 3-day siege, the Muscovites hesitated. The presence of the Russian princes, who acted as guarantors of safety, finally convinced them. Prince Ostej, the boyars, and the clergy made a fatal mistake in deciding to believe the oaths. A solemn procession, led by the prince and priests, came out of the city to meet the Khan. As soon as the procession passed through the gates, the horde's forces immediately broke their oath. They fell upon the unarmed people and slaughtered every last one of them, with Prince Ostej being the first to fall. Through the open gates, the horde's cavalry poured into the defenseless city. The deception had succeeded, and Moscow had fallen. A terrible massacre and plunder began. A monstrous slaughter unfolded in the city. People were killed indiscriminately, sparing neither women nor children. Those who tried to take refuge in churches were burned alive. The horde's forces looted everything of any value, seized the princely treasury, and carried off thousands of inhabitants into slavery. Moscow was completely destroyed. After staying in the burned-out Moscow for only a few days, Tokhtamysh, with immense booty, began his return journey. Along the way, his detachments ravaged and burned Vladimir, Zvenigorod, Mojaisk, and other Russian cities. The punitive expedition was successfully completed. Only one of his detachments suffered a minor defeat. Dmitry Donskoy, upon his return, found a scene of complete devastation. The lesson was brutal but effective. In the autumn of that same year, to receive the Yarlik for the Grand Principality, he was forced to send his eldest son, Vasily, to the horde as a hostage. The payment of tribute was resumed in full. Rus once again acknowledged itself as a vassal of the Golden Horde. The campaign of 1382 became the zenith of Tokhtamysh's power. He achieved all his goals. He showed the world the revival of the horde, brutally punished his rebellious vassals, and returned to Sarai with untold riches and the glory of an invincible conqueror. Sitting in his palace, he likely believed that his power now had no limits. He was on top of the world. But it was precisely at this moment of supreme triumph that the seeds of pride were sown in Tokhtamysh's soul, which would ultimately lead him to disaster. He forgot who had helped him, a rootless exile, to come to power. He forgot about his father and patron, the great Emir Timur. And Timur was watching his son's successes closely. On the southern borders of the horde, a new, even more terrible knot of contradictions was already tightening, the Khwarezmian knot. Tokhtamysh's triumph proved to be short-lived. After the burning of Moscow, he became the absolute master of a vast empire for several years, but ahead of him lay a clash that would determine not only his fate, but the fate of his entire people. After pacifying Rus, Tokhtamysh reached the peak of his power. He became the master of a colossal territory from Siberia to the Balkans. The Khan's authority in the horde had not been so unified and undisputed for almost half a century, since the reign of Janibek. All internal enemies were destroyed, and external vassals were brought to complete submission. Tokhtamysh proved himself not only as a conqueror, but also as a far-sighted statesman. He understood perfectly well that the foundation of his empire's prosperity was international trade, and therefore he actively patronized the caravan routes, ensuring their safety. Relations with the Genoese colonies were particularly important to him. Relations with the Genoese trading posts in the Crimea and at the mouth of the Don were a priority for him. All Black Sea trade, which brought enormous revenues, passed through these cities. Tokhtamysh confirmed their privileges with special yarliks, which ensured a stable flow of huge duties into the Horde's treasury. His trade policy was extremely successful. Archaeological finds and numismatic data testify to a genuine flourishing of the Volga cities during his reign. In New Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, and Bulgar, crafts thrived: pottery, jewelry, and weaponry. On the coins minted in his name, he was called by magnificent titles, such as the Just Sultan Tokhtamysh Khan, may his reign be prolonged. His power over Rusas was also absolute. The Russian princes paid tribute without a murmur, and Dmitry Donskoy's eldest son, Vasily, spent several years in the Horde as an honored hostage. Tokhtamysh applied the classic imperial policy of divide and rule, distributing yarliks at his discretion and setting the princes against each other to prevent any one of them from becoming too powerful. His authority was also recognized on the western borders. The Lithuanian prince Jogaila, who also became the king of Poland, sought an alliance with him. Even the distant Egyptian Mamluks sent embassies with rich gifts to Sarai. It seemed that he had restored the empire of Yoki in all its former splendor. It was at this moment, at the pinnacle of fame and power, that he made his main and fatal mistake. At the peak of his power, Tokhtamysh decided that he was not just equal to, but superior to his former patron, Emir Timur. He forgot how Timur had saved him, a ragged fugitive, given him an army, and helped him ascend the throne. Hubris and self-confidence completely blinded him. In his eyes, Timur was merely a rootless upstart. Tokhtamysh, a legitimate descendant of Genghis Khan, considered himself superior to the upstart emir. He sincerely believed that all the lands that had once been part of the Mongol Empire rightfully belonged to the Genghisids. This meant that Transoxiana and Timur's other conquests were his, Tokhtamysh's, legitimate property. His imperial ambitions inevitably clashed with Timur's. The formal pretext for war was the dispute over Khwarezm. This ancient and wealthy region in the lower reaches of the Amu Darya, with its capital Urgench, was a true gem of Central Asia, a major center of crafts and trade. The conflict began over this strategically important and fabulously rich territory. Historically, Khwarezm had been part of the Ulus of Yoki. During the Great Troubles, it had effectively seceded from the Horde, but was then conquered by Timur, who could not tolerate the existence of such a rich and independent neighbor. Timur considered Khwarezm his legitimate conquest. When Tokhtamysh united the Horde, he immediately demanded the return of this territory. Tokhtamysh demanded the return of Khwarezm from Timur in an ultimatum-like and defiant manner. Timur was furious. To give up what was won by force of arms would mean showing weakness and acknowledging Tokhtamysh's supremacy. He, of course, refused. From that moment, relations between the former patron and his protege began to deteriorate rapidly. Tokhtamysh began to seek allies and support rebellious emirs in Timur's domains. And in 1385, while Timur was at war in Persia, he took the most treacherous step. He invaded Azerbaijan. This was a direct stab in the back, and this territory was also historically disputed. Tokhtamysh's troops swept through Azerbaijan, which Timur already considered his sphere of influence, with fire and sword. They took and plundered its wealthy capital, the city of Tabriz. The booty was so colossal that, according to chroniclers, Even common soldiers were laden with jewels and silk. It was a daring and incredibly successful raid. This raid on Tabriz was the last straw for Timur. It was not just a military invasion, but a personal insult, a violation of all oaths and concepts of gratitude. It was a stab in the back from someone he had once called his son. The betrayal had been committed, and the Iron Lame was known for his animalistic vengefulness. Timur never forgave betrayal. From that moment, a major war became inevitable. He began to prepare for a large-scale campaign into the heart of the Deshti Kipchak. He understood perfectly well that Tokhtamysh was a formidable and dangerous opponent, but he was determined to destroy the threat from the north once and for all. Intoxicated by the easy victory in Tabriz, Tokhtamysh also prepared for war. He was absolutely confident in his strength and believed that in an open steppe war, his nomads had an undeniable advantage over Timur's army. He believed that the great steppe itself would help him defeat the intruder from the south. He was too self-confident. The two former allies had become mortal enemies. At stake was not just power over Khwarezm or Azerbaijan, but dominance over all of Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The whole world held its breath in anticipation of this titanic clash. A great war was coming, and its outcome would be decided on the banks of the distant Kondurcha River. In the winter of 1390-1391, Timur, with all his fearsome thoroughness, prepared for the campaign. This was not to be a mere punitive raid, but a campaign of total annihilation. He announced a gathering of all the forces of his vast empire, from the borders of India to the Caucasus. He was preparing for a total, merciless war. Timur's army was not just a horde, but a complex, well-organized military machine. It included heavy and light cavalry, infantry, and even primitive artillery. Weapons were forged in smithies and workshops, and the emir himself personally inspected the troops. He managed to assemble a colossal force of about 200,000 men, one of the most advanced armies of its time. In January 1391, this gigantic armada set out from Tashkent to the north. In January 1391, Timur's huge army moved north. Its target was Tokhtamysh's capital, the city of Sarai, and its path lay through the vast, deserted, and hostile steppes of the Deshti Kipchak. Learning of Timur's advance, Tokhtamysh chose the classic and time-tested tactic of the nomads, a scorched earth policy. Tokhtamysh decided not to accept battle on the border. His mobile detachments retreated deep into the steppe, burning the grass behind them, poisoning wells, and driving off livestock. The calculation was simple: to lure Timur's army deep into his territory, exhaust it with hunger and thirst, and then deliver a decisive, fatal blow to the weakened enemy. An unprecedented 5-month march of death began. Timur's army moved through the lifeless steppe, suffering from hunger and the loss of horses. Even his emirs grumbled and urged him to turn back. But Timur's iron will held the army together and led it forward. The emir's leadership qualities saved his army from certain collapse. Finally, in June 1391, after 5 months of exhausting pursuit, the armies met in the Trans-Volga region near the Kondurcha River. Tokhtamysh decided that Timur's army was sufficiently weakened for a general battle. His own forces, on their home ground, probably outnumbered the exhausted enemy. On June 18, 1391, one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages began. Tokhtamysh arranged his army in the traditional crescent formation of the nomads. Powerful flanks were to envelop and encircle the enemy army, and in the center, he placed his best infantry. He used a tactic proven by time and dozens of victories. But Timur, a military genius, completely deciphered this plan. Timur, anticipating Tokhtamysh's plan, arranged his army in 7 corps, creating several lines of defense and leaving a powerful reserve under his personal command. In front of the army, he ordered a ditch to be dug and barriers to be set up to neutralize the first fierce onslaught of the horde's cavalry. His formation was much more complex and well thought out. The battle began with a furious attack by the horde's cavalry. The blow was of such crushing force that the right flank of Timur's army faltered and began to retreat. For a moment, it seemed that victory would be Tokhtamysh's. His warriors broke through the first line of defense and even began to loot Timur's baggage train. It was at this critical moment that Timur displayed all his military genius. At the decisive moment of the battle, Timur personally led his elite reserve into the fight. His warriors delivered a crushing counterattack on the flank and rear of the horde's forces that had broken through, while another of his corps, previously hidden in a ravine, attacked the center of Tokhtamysh's army. The horde's battle order was broken, and their attack choked. A fierce hand-to-hand struggle began, lasting for 3 days. It was a real slaughterhouse, in which the outcome of the battle was decided not only by Timur's brilliant tactics, but also by the iron discipline of his army. Unlike the horde's warriors, who were prone to looting in the middle of a battle, Timur's soldiers fought as a single, cohesive mechanism. On the 3rd day of the battle, Tokhtamysh's army, having suffered colossal losses, wavered and broke into a panicked flight. Timur immediately organized a pursuit, and his cavalry chased and cut down the fleeing warriors for hundreds of kilometers. The defeat of the Golden Horde turned into a monstrous catastrophe. After the victory, Timur's army was too exhausted to march on Sarai. He camped for 26 days at the site of the battle, celebrating the victory and gathering trophies, after which he turned back to Samarkand. Tokhtamysh himself barely managed to escape. The Battle of the Kondurcha River was a terrible blow to him, but he was not yet broken. This first major defeat seriously undermined Tokhtamysh's authority. He lost the flower of his army, his prestige, and his reputation as an invincible leader. His empire began to crack at the seams, and many emirs in the east began to turn away from him. It seemed that he was finished, but Tokhtamysh would not have been himself if he had given up. In his character was an astonishing, almost supernatural ability to recover. He had lost a battle, but not the war. He had fled the battlefield, but he was not broken. Licking his wounds and nursing his rage, he was already planning his revenge. He would return to challenge Timur, but it would be his last and fatal gamble. Any other ruler in his place would have been immediately overthrown. But Tokhtamysh possessed incredible vitality and a keen political instinct. He understood perfectly well that the nomads respected only strength and luck, and he needed to prove as quickly as possible that he was still capable of leading his people. Returning to Sarai, he found his empire cracking at the seams. Upon his return, Tokhtamysh faced a grim picture. Many eastern uluses had broken away from him, and Timur, as he left, had installed his own puppet khans at their head, chosen from among Tokhtamysh's blood enemies, the descendants of Urus Khan. Separatists also raised their heads within the Golden Horde itself. His state was rapidly disintegrating. But Tokhtamysh acted with astonishing energy, relying on the core of his power, the nomadic aristocracy of the Volga and North Black Sea regions. He announced a new army recruitment. He sent messengers to all the uluses, calling, persuading, and threatening, using his unquestionable authority as a legitimate Genghisid. And the steppe, strangely enough, responded. The Golden Horde's ability to quickly regenerate its military forces was truly phenomenal. Every nomad was a born warrior who did not require long training. It was only necessary to sound the call, and tens of thousands of horsemen would flock to the Khan's banners again. In a short time, Tokhtamysh assembled a new army, no smaller than the previous one. The new army was no smaller in number than the one defeated at Kondurcha. Soon, he restored his authority over most of the ulus of Jochi, expelling Timur's protege. The horde's economy, based on control over trade and tribute from vassals, also recovered relatively quickly. He had achieved the almost impossible, restoring his former power. This newfound strength went to his head. Tokhtamysh had learned nothing from his crushing defeat. Driven by hatred and a blind faith that the loss at Kondurcha was just a random tactical error, he decided to take revenge. He longed to prove to the whole world that he, a legitimate Genghisid, was stronger than the rootless emir. In 1394, he decided the time for a new strike had come. He entered into negotiations with the Egyptian Mamluks and the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, trying to create a broad coalition against Timur. However, impatience got the better of him, and without waiting for the alliance to be fully formed, he began to act. In the autumn of 1394, he made his last desperate move. In the autumn of 1394, while Timur was busy with a war in Mesopotamia, Tokhtamysh once again struck from behind. Gathering all his forces, he invaded the Caucasus through the Derbent Pass and fell upon Shirvan, a rich state that was a vassal of Timur. He again repeated his old, proven tactic of a treacherous attack. This campaign was even more audacious than the previous raid on Tabriz. Tokhtamysh acted as a full-fledged master, invading the very heart of his enemy's domains. He ravaged the cities of Shirvan, captured immense booty, and then turned north and camped on the Terek River, defiantly awaiting Timur's reaction. It was an open and bold challenge. Timur's reaction was predictable and terrible. When he was informed of the new invasion, his fury knew no bounds. The ungrateful son had not only not repented, but had delivered a new, even more insulting blow. Chroniclers write that he swore this time, not just to expel Tokhtamysh, but to destroy his entire ulus, to ruin its cities and exterminate its people, to put an end to the threat from the north forever. The second great campaign of Timur against the Golden Horde began. This time, he was driven not by cold political calculation, but by an all-consuming thirst for revenge. Tokhtamysh awaited him in the North Caucasus, on the bank of the Terek River. He was confident in his position and believed in victory, not knowing that on the banks of the Terek, the fate of not only himself, but of his entire empire would be decided. A storm was coming that would wipe a whole world from the face of the earth. In the spring of 1395, in the foothills of the North Caucasus, on the northern bank of the Terek River, stood the giant camp of Khan Tokhtamysh. The mood in his vast army was martial. The horror of the past defeat was forgotten. It seemed that this time, luck would be on the side of the legitimate Genghisid, and the horde was fully prepared for revenge. Timur's army was approaching from the south. Timur led his forces through the passes of the Caucasus, brutally suppressing the resistance of the Highlanders. On April 15, 1395, his vanguard reached the Terek. The two greatest armies of that time stood facing each other, separated by the river. For several days, the opponents maneuvered along the banks, seeking the most advantageous position for the upcoming battle. Tokhtamysh fortified his bank, placing guards at all known forts. Then Timur used a military ruse. He pretended to retreat upstream, forcing Tokhtamysh to follow him. This race continued for several days until Timur found a suitable spot and, under the cover of night, forced the river. By morning, most of his army was already on the northern bank, and Tokhtamysh had to accept battle under unfavorable conditions. The Battle of the Terek became one of the most grandiose and fierce in history. Tokhtamysh, taught by the bitter experience of Kondurcha, arranged his army in a deeper, echeloned order, strengthening the center. Timur, on the other hand, relied on a powerful ramming strike in the center and his favorite tactic of a strong flanking reserve. Both commanders applied all their skill. The battle began with the traditional exchange of arrows, after which Tokhtamysh launched his cavalry in an attack on both flanks. On the left flank, the horde's forces crushed the enemy's advance units and began to push them back. It seemed that Tokhtamysh was on the verge of victory. He was already anticipating his long-awaited revenge, but the course of the battle changed dramatically. As at Kondurcha, at the critical moment, Timur personally led the counterattack of his strategic reserve. The strike of the elite heavy cavalry was delivered at the junction between the center and the flank of the horde's army. In addition, according to some chroniclers, some of Tokhtamysh's emirs, bribed in advance by Timur, betrayed their Khan in the heat of battle and left the field. The center of Tokhtamysh's army, attacked from the front and flank, wavered. Then Timur used another trick. His warriors began to shout loudly that Khan Tokhtamysh had fled the battlefield. This cry, repeated thousands of times, caused panic in the ranks of the horde. The psychological attack finally broke their fighting spirit. The horde's formation collapsed, and a disorderly, panicked flight began. It instantly turned into a monstrous slaughter. Timur's cavalry pursued and mercilessly exterminated the demoralized warriors. As a result of this rout, the army of the Golden Horde essentially ceased to exist. Tokhtamysh himself once again miraculously escaped. This time, Timur was not satisfied with just a victory in battle. He decided to fulfill his terrible oath and destroy the ulus of Jochi itself. His army, divided into several corps, moved deep into the territory of the Golden Horde. A methodical economic and demographic genocide began. His goal was not conquest, but complete and final destruction. Timur's army passed through the lands of the Horde like a plague of locusts. All the largest cities were taken, plundered, and burned to the ground. New Sarai, Old Sarai, Haji Tarkhan, Bulgar, Tana. These once thriving centers of civilization were literally wiped from the face of the earth. Archaeological excavations at the site of Sarai show a thick layer of ash, after which the city was abandoned forever. Timur purposefully destroyed the economic foundation of the Golden Horde's power. He destroyed the irrigation systems in the Volga region, crushed the Genoese trading posts, and redirected the caravan routes from the steppes to his capital, Samarkand. The northern branch of the Great Silk Road, which had brought colossal revenues to the Horde, was paralyzed. Timur's campaign of 1395-1396 was a mortal blow to the Golden Horde. It was not just a military catastrophe, but a civilizational collapse. Cities were destroyed. A significant part of the population was exterminated or taken into slavery, and trade was undermined. The Horde was thrown back a century in its development, and once again turned into a wild steppe, torn by internecine strife. On the ruins of the Golden Horde, new state formations would soon begin to emerge. The Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimean, and Siberian Khanats, as well as the Nogai Horde. The apocalypse on the Terek River was the end of the great empire of Jochi, and the main culprit of this monstrous catastrophe was its last great Khan. The author of this tragedy was Tokhtamysh himself. Blinded by pride, he challenged a force he could not handle and plunged his country into a fire that burned it to the ground. His personal tragedy became the tragedy of a whole people. The defeat at the Terek turned the all-powerful Khan into an eternal exile. The last decade of Tokhtamysh's life is the tragic story of a man who became a Khan without a Khanate, a commander without an army. Of his former greatness, only memories remained. But even in this absolutely hopeless situation, he did not give up. and, to his last breath, desperately clung to the shadow of power. He did not accept defeat. After fleeing the battlefield at the Terek, he found temporary refuge in the lands of the Volga Bulgars. As soon as Timur's troops left for the south, Tokhtamysh began to gather supporters again. However, now he had a new mortal enemy within the horde itself, the powerful and cunning Emir Edigu, one of Timur's former commanders. Emir Edigu, like Mamai, was not a Genghisid, but after Timur's departure, he became the de facto ruler in the region between the Volga and the Yaik. He was a kingmaker, placing his puppet khans on the throne in Sarai. For Edigu, the return of the strong and, most importantly, legitimate Tokhtamysh was absolutely unacceptable. A new gray cardinal had appeared in the horde. A long and merciless struggle began between Tokhtamysh and Edigu. Several times Tokhtamysh managed to capture Sarai, but each time Edigu drove him out. The old Khan's forces dwindled in endless internecine strife. Realizing he could not cope alone, he began to seek help from outside the horde and turned his gaze to the west. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, led by the ambitious Grand Duke Vytautas, was at the peak of its power. Like Timur many years before, Vytautas saw the exiled Khan as a valuable tool for his grand policy. He dreamed of subjugating the Golden Horde by placing his own vassal on its throne. He decided to use Tokhtamysh for his own ends. They formed an alliance. Vytautas received Tokhtamysh with honor, settled him in Kiev, and promised military aid in reclaiming the throne. In return, the desperate Khan issued him a yarlik, effectively giving Lithuania control over all the Russian lands that had previously paid tribute to the horde. The culmination of this alliance was the Great Campaign of 1399. In 1399, Vytautas assembled a huge coalition army. It included Lithuanian, Russian, and Polish regiments, as well as detachments of crusaders and the remnants of Tokhtamysh's forces. The goal of the campaign was to defeat Edigu and his protege, Khan Timur Kutluk. Vytautas was so confident of victory that he began distributing the horde's uluses among his companions in advance. The decisive battle took place on August 12, 1399, on the Vorskla River. The army of Edigu and Timur Kutluk was smaller, but it consisted of steppe warriors hardened in countless battles. Before the battle, negotiations were held, during which Timur Kutluk tried to buy time until the main forces of Edigu arrived. During the bold negotiations, Edigu rejected Vytautas's arrogant demands. He stated that the Lithuanian prince could not be the father of the Khan, as he was not a Genghisid, and himself demanded submission in an ultimatum. Such a response was tantamount to a declaration of war, and battle became inevitable. A clash of ambitions made peace impossible. Vytautas, having an advantage in artillery and heavy cavalry, attacked first, and initially his army had success. But the experienced commander Edigu used the favorite tactic of the nomads, a feigned retreat. He lured the Lithuanian army deep into the steppe, after which his cavalry, bypassing the enemy on the flanks, delivered a crushing blow from the rear. Vytautas's army was surrounded and completely routed. This defeat became one of the most terrible disasters in the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Many noble princes and knights died in the battle. Vytautas himself barely escaped, and Tokhtamysh, seeing that the battle was lost, was one of the first to flee the field. His last hope had collapsed. Having lost his last powerful patron, Tokhtamysh was doomed to inglorious wandering. The last years of his life were a series of humiliating attempts to find refuge. He roamed the outskirts of his former empire, eternally pursued by Edigu's men. He became an eternal exile without a home and without a future. The end of the last great Khan was inglorious. In 1406 or 1407, they caught up with him. On Adigu's orders, a detachment of warriors tracked him down somewhere in the region of modern-day Tyumen. In a short, fierce skirmish, Tokhtamysh was killed. His life, full of rises and falls, ended in obscurity, and his body was left to lie in the steppe. Thus ended the turbulent and tragic life of a Khan without a Khanate, who fought to his last breath for the shadow of his former power. He was the last ruler to unite the Ulus of Yochi into a single fist. After his death, the process of the Golden Horde's disintegration became final and irreversible. With his death, an entire era passed away. The world he had once shaken with his deeds had almost forgotten him by the time of his death. But his actions, like a stone thrown into water, left behind ripples that would define the fate of Eurasia for centuries. His legacy proved to be paradoxical. He was both a great restorer and the unwitting gravedigger of his own empire. The main outcome of his reign was the final collapse of the Golden Horde. Yes, he was the last Khan who managed to reassemble the crumbling Ulus and briefly halt the process of decay. But his own excessive pride led to the war with Timur, which dealt the Horde a fatal, mortal blow. Timur's campaign of 1395-1396 was a true civilizational catastrophe for the Horde. The destruction of cities, the undermining of trade, and the extermination of the population deprived the empire of its economic and political foundation. After this terrible blow, it was never able to recover as a single, centralized state. The second most important consequence of Tokhtamysh's actions was the change in the balance of power in Eastern Europe. His punitive campaign against Moscow in 1382 seemingly restored the Horde's dominion. But in the long run, it was the very destruction of the Horde by Timur, provoked by him, that created the conditions for the future rise of Moscow. The weakened and fragmented Horde could no longer effectively control its northern vassals. The Russian princes continued to pay tribute for almost another century, but it was now a complex diplomatic game, not total submission. It was in the 15th century that the Principality of Moscow began its rapid growth, which allowed it to prepare for the final overthrow of the yoke in 1480. In wanting to humiliate Moscow, Tokhtamysh ultimately only contributed to its rise. The war between the two titans led to a colossal strengthening of Timur's empire. By destroying his main rival in the north, the Iron Lame secured his borders and was able to focus on conquests in India and the Middle East. Furthermore, the defeat of the Golden Horde led to a redirection of trade routes, which now passed through Samarkand, enriching Timur's state. Timur became the main beneficiary of this war. The image of Tokhtamysh in history has remained extremely contradictory. In Russian chronicles, he is the fierce Tsar, the merciless destroyer of Moscow. In the Persian chronicles at the court of the Timurids, he is the ungrateful and treacherous betrayer who challenged his benefactor and was justly punished for it. His image depends entirely on the chronicler's point of view. But if we look at him objectively, he appears as a figure of truly tragic proportions. He was the last paladin of a passing era, the last ruler who thought in terms of a unified empire of Genghis Khan. A talented commander and an energetic administrator, he managed to do the almost impossible, to resurrect a state from the ashes of civil war. The clash between Tokhtamysh and Timur was a conflict of two worlds. On one side was the old nomadic aristocracy, represented by Tokhtamysh. On the other was a new type of state, Timur's military feudal empire, which relied on strong centralized power and a regular army. In this struggle, the old world was doomed to defeat. Tokhtamysh lost not because he was a bad commander, but because the wheel of history had turned. His empire, based on an extensive economy and clan ties, could not withstand Timur's ruthless military administrative machine. His story is the eternal drama of a man who flew too high and scorched his wings, striving to restore the past, but in the end, only accelerating the arrival of the future. In that future, which he unwittingly brought closer, there was no longer a place for a unified Golden Horde, but there was a place for the Tsardom of Muscovy, for the Ottoman Empire, and for the new Khanates that grew on the smoking ruins of his state. His war changed the face of the world forever. Thank you for walking this long and bloody path with us. The story of Tokhtamysh is a dark saga of power, pride, and fate. If this tale of the last Khan of the Horde resonated with you, subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. New chronicles of the people whose destinies shaped the course of history await you.